Europe needs immigration to keep functioning. Or does it? Well, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who was elected on an anti-immigration platform, granted 400,000 worker permits to help address labor shortages. Yet at the same time, following an election defeat, Frans Timmermans, leader of the left-wing PvdA GroenLinks in the Netherlands, has stated that uncontrolled immigration would blow up the Dutch welfare state. These conflicting statements make it pretty hard to know what's actually going on and if immigration is actually good for Europe's economy. To make matters more complicated, most immigration debate in English is about the United States, which receives different immigrants and has radically different labor and welfare systems from that of European countries. And that's why I spent the past couple of weeks diving into some of the most recent studies that have come out on this subject for European countries, to try and navigate the highly politicized topic of immigrants and the economy. And I did all of this work reading study after study and navigating government databases just to be called a racist in the comment section. And also to answer the question of whether immigration is actually good for European economies, European workers, what it means for European welfare states in the long run, and seeing what would happen if Europe adopted a Japanese-style approach by severely limiting immigration. Anyways, this is the story of the economics of immigration. This video doesn't have a sponsor and is made possible by InterEurope's Patreon supporters. So, Europe is taking in a lot of immigrants and politicians want to have even more. While this policy is partially driven by European sentiments of guilt surrounding colonialism and the impoverishing and destabilizing role it had across the world, Europe's hunger for migrants in the past and today is principally justified through the necessity to tackle three major economic challenges. Europe, like much of the world, is aging rapidly, and this is posing three major economic problems for European countries. The first is that much of Europe is experiencing a demographic-led labor shortage. Because there are fewer people of working age, it's simply harder to find people in sectors like construction, agriculture, as well as skilled labor for jobs like technicians that form the backbone of the economy. A steady supply of labor can help keep labor prices low and help European industries remain competitive. And the thing is that this labor is needed in order to maintain prosperity. Fewer people means fewer goods and services can both be produced but also consumed, which would reduce the overall prosperity of Europe. In other words, with a decreasing population, Europe would experience a form of degrowth, with businesses closing due to a shrinking number of consumers buying their products. And this shrinking prosperity could be a problem if Europe wants to tackle its third challenge, maintaining the welfare state. That's because with more people retiring, the ratio of non-workers to workers in European countries has risen steadily over the past 2 decades, putting a lot of pressure on the welfare state. More old people means more pensions and healthcare spending, which has to be paid for by a shrinking pool of laborers, something that I covered in a previous video. And that's why many European countries have turned to immigration to tackle or at least reduce some of these problems. Over the past 2 decades, European countries have opened their doors to large quantities of immigrants, either through regular channels like the Schengen area, the deliverance of additional work permits, its family reunification policy, by opening its doors to refugees, or through irregular channels with migrants crossing the Mediterranean. So can these immigrants help tackle Europe's three economic challenges? Well, in order to answer that, we first have to distinguish between different types of immigration. Some of the absolute worst studies and books and news articles that I've read on the subject of immigration have been terrible because they fail to put immigrants into different categories. Most do this because they either don't refer to data that makes the distinction, or what I can only assume is to muddle the waters on the actual impact of different types of immigration. From the studies I've read, there are basically 4 ways to classify immigrants, which I'll have to jump in between when talking about immigration's economic impact. The first classification is between high-skilled and low-skilled, with a separate subcategory for refugees, which is often used to study economic impact and employment rates. The second is a distinction between EU and non-EU migration, which from what I could tell is mainly because of how EU immigrants are a separate category in most demographic and economic data produced by Eurostat, the Statistics Bureau of the European Union. This is also pretty useful since EU versus non-EU tends to match up pretty closely, though not perfectly, with the high-low skill divide. The third is nearly exclusive to Denmark, which separates immigrants according to their country of origin. And finally, another type of data focuses on the type of permits people come on, whether it be for work, study, family reunification, or as refugees, which again can be used for comparing the effectiveness of different entry points for immigrants and how they affect the labor market. So now that we know about the distinctions, back to the first of our 3 economic problems. Do immigrants prevent labor shortages in critical jobs? And actually, do immigrants work at all? Well, according to official data, a majority of immigrants do end up working, but there are some pretty big disparities between groups in terms of employment. If we look at the statistics from Eurostat, EU immigrants actually outpace that of natives, while that of non-EU immigrants is usually quite a bit lower. According to this separate study, refugees are less likely to work compared with other immigrants. Employment for refugees is basically zero for the first year in Germany, as they aren't allowed to work while their paperwork gets processed. In Finland, only 22% of refugees are employed after a decade. The International Labour Organization seems to confirm this, with it taking about 20 years for refugees in Sweden to catch up with family reunification immigrants in terms of employment. Rigid rules to look for work, language barriers, and workplace discrimination slow down immigrants joining the workforce. For refugees, it also has to do with the bureaucracy that prevents them from working in the first place, as well as the generosity of European welfare states. In Denmark, male refugees found employment faster once they experienced benefit reductions. This is in sharp contrast to the US, where there is less welfare and more incentive to work. Refugees catch up with the high employment rates of other immigrants after a decade, with nearly 80% employment. It might explain why France, Italy, Germany, Denmark, and other European countries have moved to cut public benefits to refugees, but also immigrants in general, to push them into the workforce. But with most immigrants actually working, we can ask ourselves what jobs immigrants actually fill. Because all the studies agree that Europe is facing a labor shortage, particularly for lower-skilled professions. Well, according to the EU data, immigrants do go work in low-skilled jobs with labor shortages. But again, there are some huge disparities between jobs. Migrants are overrepresented in jobs like building frame workers, bartenders, and waiters in countries with no labor shortages, while at the same time, more migrants were called upon to fill jobs like machinery mechanics and repairers, structural metal workers, drivers, and personnel care workers in countries that did have shortages. If we look at individual country data, in France, the jobs where immigrants were the likeliest to work were in household help for care and cleaning, security agents, waiters, cooks, or for municipal maintenance. In Germany, they were for cleaning, food production, transportation, construction, and tourism. And that's a problem considering that Europe's labor shortages are more related to talent than they are with the actual amount of workers. So does that mean that immigration is not actually contributing to fixing Europe's second problem, that of a shrinking GDP and decreasing prosperity? Well, growing your population is one of the surest ways to increase your country's GDP. In 2023, 64% of job growth and half of the economic growth in Spain can be linked to immigration. For highly skilled workers, the benefits are quite clear. They lead to productivity growth across the economy. But it's not all bad for low-skilled workers. According to the study from the World Bank, low-skilled workers might still have an impact on productivity by allowing skilled workers, mainly natives, to specialize more. For example, if one of my parents were sick, me and my siblings would have to take care of them, but by having a healthcare worker, a significant amount of whom are lower-skilled immigrants, I might be able to spend more time on the hyper-productive activity of producing YouTube videos. But this is an effect that is hard to measure, and I haven't found any studies explicitly attempting to measure it. The other way immigrants increase prosperity is by consuming goods and services. Let's say that I'm now a baker and I sell 4 baguettes a day. If I can now sell 6 because more people moved into town, I became more productive and might now be able to hire some help to grow my business. The increased population simply makes more businesses possible and increases quality of service. However, this increase in consumption might also pose a problem when it comes to things like housing, for which there's currently a serious supply limitation and which I touched upon in a previous video. So while immigrants do actually grow the economy in terms of GDP, we can ask ourselves what their impact is on public finances, or in other words, whether immigrants help save the welfare state. There's this pretty new type of graph that looks at your net fiscal balance. It basically measures how much taxes you pay versus how much you receive in social benefits over the course of your lifetime. Generally speaking, you first consume a lot of welfare through childcare and education. As a working adult, you produce more than you pay in, and as a retiree, you once again become a beneficiary when you receive healthcare and your pension. High-skilled people tend to be more productive, pay more taxes, and claim fewer benefits, meaning they're a net gain for the welfare state, while lower-skilled people earn less, produce less, and have a much lower contribution. 5 economists associated with the Joint Research Council of the European Union actually looked into this for different immigrant groups. The result was that non-EU immigrants contributed fewer taxes, which should come as no surprise since the bulk of them are low-skilled. Meanwhile, EU migrants, which tend to be highly educated, contributed much more than natives. The Danish government actually takes this a step further, classifying immigrants and their descendants according to their regions of origin. Middle Eastern migrants had negative fiscal contributions their entire lives because of a younger retirement age, low workforce participation, particularly for women, but also because they belong mostly to the low-skilled labor pool. So what is immigration's actual impact on public finances? Well, high-skilled workers and EU immigrants actually make huge contributions in terms of taxes, which is why European countries are actively fighting each other to attract young and highly skilled workers, but also talent from across the world. For low-skilled immigrants, that's less clear-cut. On the surface level, most of the benefit comes from the fact that there's a demographic dividend to adding workers without having to raise or educate them. Refugees have additional costs on the welfare state when they arrive in the form of housing, handouts, and education, some of which may last a long time if they aren't put to work. But there are some pretty big differences between countries about the impact of these immigrants on government balances. This study looking into the total amount of taxes versus benefits received between 2007 and 2018 found that in Germany, France, and Sweden, non-EU immigrants were a net drained and performed worse than natives. In Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, immigrants, including non-EU immigrants, paid more taxes and drew out fewer benefits than natives. If I had to guess, this can be linked with the age structure of immigrants in those countries, who tend to be more recent arrivals and younger, and therefore likelier to work. But this isn't the full picture. After all, there might be some additional benefits that we aren't taking into account, in the form of what's called indirect fiscal benefits to immigration. After all, if immigrants increase the output of other workers, particularly the highly skilled, then some of their higher output might be assigned to the immigrants themselves. If, for example, the healthcare assistant for my parents allows me to produce 3 videos a month instead of 2, then perhaps some of my productivity and the taxes I pay could actually be down to his or her help. Again, this effect is hard to measure directly in an economy, but according to Mark Golos and Dominique Sachs, modeling the effects in the US, it's estimated that it would make up $750 in taxes per immigrant. That's not enough to make up for the total gap between welfare and taxes, but still pretty significant. Now, I couldn't find any comparable study about Europe, but based off of the parameters on which this is calculated, which include the size of social benefits, worker participation, and income, if we had to guess the size of this effect for European countries compared to the US, I would say it's quite a bit smaller. While low-skilled immigrants offer a short-term economic dividend due to their age, if they settle permanently, as Europe's immigration systems usually allow them to, then the cost they pose on Europe's welfare system will increase as they age and retire, but also when they have children. According to the Joint Research Council study, across nearly all welfare systems of the EU, the cost of non-EU children is far greater than that of native or EU children. Immigrant families tend to be much larger and subsidized to Europe's welfare states to alleviate poverty and improve educational outcomes of lower income groups. The only reason that this isn't the case in the so-called Mediterranean corporatist model seems to be that Spain and Italy have some of the stingiest family support policies for new parents, meaning they give out little in general, resulting in the low differences between immigrants and natives. While these children could eventually help with the lack of workers, if we look into PISA scores, an international standardized test, the human capital of immigrant-descended children in European countries is usually far lower than that of native children. And despite some gains for the second-generation immigrants, it remains much lower than natives still. This can often be explained by the lower educational background of parents, but it also shows that catching up for some communities, if at all possible, is at the very least a multi-generational endeavor. And it depends on how well immigrants' descendants are integrated. While EU-descended immigrants tend to outperform natives in the labor market, have better jobs and higher employment rates, it's fair to say that in many European countries, integration of certain non-EU communities has lagged. According to Eurostat, the average employment of all immigrants across the EU was nearly 7% lower for second-generation migrants than for natives, and lower than the first generation, though there are some huge disparities between countries. In Belgium, Ireland, and Spain, second-gen immigrants perform far worse than their parents, while in Germany and the Netherlands, second-generation immigrants caught up a bit with natives. While this might mean that many immigrants and their descendants are involved in the informal economy, it also means that these descendants are less likely to pay taxes. And because of the high cost of raising children, lower participation of second-gen immigrants in the workforce, low-skilled immigration is likely a drain on the welfare state in the long run. But if we only look at these aspects, we might forget that there are some other aspects of immigration that we need to talk about. And that's because it's impossible to talk about immigration without looking at how it affects natives. When we look at the full picture, like what Anthony Ito and Sam Ozguzel did for European countries, immigration in general has been mostly bad for low-skilled natives, who saw decreases in employment in the short term, which eventually returned to more of a long-term equilibrium. Meanwhile, skilled workers saw gains in the long run. But the picture is actually a bit more complicated if we apply the categories that we talked about at the start of the video. And that's because as a native, you benefit more from the immigrants different from you. Low-skilled laborers, particularly those that were immigrants themselves, are affected by the arrival of other immigrants who compete for the same jobs. It might explain why, in the plot twist that no one expected, the anti-immigration AfD in Germany has been targeting the ethnic minority votes. They're the ones most at risk from newer immigrants taking their jobs and are the most impacted in terms of their salaries. So this seems to suggest that, all in all, low-skilled migration is bad for low-skilled workers since it raises their unemployment and decreases their wages, while it increases the opportunity for skilled workers. But there are also some societal-wide aspects to immigration which also have impacts on the economy. If including immigrants leads to declining social trust and cohesion, then that's an economic cost that's difficult to take into account in the calculations that we previously talked about. What makes this worse is the link between immigration, particularly poorly integrated immigration, and crime, which could be the subject of an entirely new video. But it's something that is taken seriously by investors to France who were afraid of the lack of safety in the country, as well as the head of Sweden's central bank who is concerned about the gang war's effect on their economy. So, do the pros for immigration outweigh the cons? Well, it depends on the type of immigration. When it comes to labor shortages, high-skilled immigration has a limited impact since most shortages are for less qualified positions. While low-skilled workers help to a degree, they only have limited employment in critical sectors. Refugees, due to low-skilled and employment levels, have limited impacts for most countries. For prosperity and GDP, both high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants raise it through their work and by being consumers, whereas refugees mostly do so by being consumers. Finally, when it comes to the welfare state, high-skilled immigration is a net positive. Low-skilled immigration is a positive in the short run, while costly in the long term, whereas refugees are a net drain. But might there be a way to change this balance and fix Europe's migration policy? Well, Europe's first lever should be to be more selective on who it lets in and who comes into their countries. Long-term economic costs should mean that it should try to limit low-skilled immigration. Europe's current migration policy, which is driven to a significant extent by refugees and family reunification, whereby immigrants are allowed to bring their families over, is not a great recipe for solving its three main economic challenges. It's mostly low-skilled, tends to have low labor force participation, increasing the burden on the welfare state without helping tackle labor shortages in the sectors Europe really needs. One way to do this would be to implement a guest worker model similar to the one that was there in the 1960s and 70s, where workers were not allowed to bring their families and expected to return home after the end of their contracts. It's currently the model in place for Poland and actually much of the rest of the world. The challenge these days is that labor migration is often tied to family reunification. And the fact that family reunification has been Europe's policy for the past 20 years means that it will be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle and return to a guest worker model. The other way to make it more beneficial is by putting immigrants to work where they are needed. Denmark has managed to increase the labor participation rate of its foreign-born population by pressuring immigrants into the workforce. In 2021, it announced that it was making social benefits for migrant women dependent on 37 hours of weekly work, while also providing educational opportunities to them. In fact, Germany's latest immigration law allows migrants to come to the country to pursue a vocational education before giving them employment opportunities. But the thing is, there are significant trade-offs between the solutions to Europe's three different goals. Short-term financing of the welfare state through mass low-skilled immigration is at odds with the long-term, and finding sufficient amount of workers is easier if you allow family reunification visas, but that would again have an impact on the welfare state. Alternatively, there's another option, if we judge that migration is simply not worth it economically or that the impact on social fabric is too high. We could decide to go for the Japan route and severely restrict it. Japan is by far the world's oldest country, and unlike many Western societies, it has received only extremely limited amounts of immigration, which makes up less than 2% of its population. As a result, Japan's attempt to limit the decline of its workforce have been focused primarily on increasing labor force participation to include more women and the elderly. While that has been somewhat successful and increased the number of workers, overall the Japanese labor force is shrinking alongside its population. This has meant decreased tax revenue, a decline in the service industry, a fall in consumption and savings as more money is redirected to taking care of the elderly. For companies, there has been a loss of knowledge as the younger generation is too small to absorb what was known by the previous generation, resulting in more workplace accidents. Companies are going bankrupt due to an inability to find workers, with a 444% increase in corporate bankruptcies between 2013 and 2019. Combined with the culture of long hours, chronic labor shortages has left its working population overworked, with one study saying that 22% of Japanese companies have employees working at levels that expose them to a serious risk of death. Yikes. And because its elderly can't fill agricultural or construction jobs, which are some of the oldest professions in the country, with the average Japanese farmer being almost 69 years old, Japan is now having to turn to some level of immigration for seasonal work. But that's not the only place where it has changed. The country has been overhauling its migration policies since 2018 to open its doors to lower skilled immigration, though most of it temporary and limited to countries that are judged similar, like Vietnam. Yet even now, restrictive immigration policies which limit the possibility for family reunification and permanent residency means that it struggles to reach its quotas for key yet lower skilled jobs like technicians. And to make matters worse, since most immigration is temporary, employers are not too keen on investing in training for staff, leading to low productivity of immigrant workers. So Japan's near-zero immigration pathway is hardly the magical society that it's sometimes pointed out to be. So where does that leave us, and how much immigration does your country need? Since this is an optimization problem, there isn't a clear-cut answer. It depends on welfare and integration policies, population aging, the retirement age, cultural identity factors that all shift with political preferences over time. It also depends on what society Europe wants. Does it want older, less populated, and less dynamic countries but with more cohesion, or younger, more dynamic economies at the cost of that social cohesion? That's the question that Europe's migration policy, or lack thereof, is answering for us. Since most immigration to Europe is through regular channels, Europeans actually have a say in the demographic and economic future of their continent through their votes. But what do you think? How much immigration does Europe actually need or should accept? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. After this video, I have many more questions related to integration, cultural compatibility, and the future of competition for immigration between countries to increase their labor force, which I hope to address in the future. If you've made it this far, I have one more message for you. As you can tell, this video is quite long, and the reason for that is that in one of my previous videos on Europe's housing crisis, I tried to condense so much information into a 12-minute format that I missed a lot of things. A lot of the legitimate criticism that I received were things that I knew already, and that existed in the 4 previous versions of the script. But the result was a video that, as some of you pointed out, focused solely on the immigration dimension and was unbalanced. In the future, I'm quite determined to be as thorough as possible, and so the result is this longer deep dive format. This type of video costs more time to make, and because of the nature of the subject, just like for previous videos related to immigration, I'm not putting a sponsor. So if you would like to support this type of work, I would like to redirect you to the Interior Patreon. Over the past couple of months, I've been turning to a crowdfunding campaign to help reach my €700 goal of renting out an office space where I can build a fixed studio, instead of recording in my co-working space. With the latest videos, my Patreon supporters recently reached €180 a month. So if you'd like to support the channel and more work like this one, go check out the Interior Patreon.